it survived the birth, it then would die, gasping for air in front of her. The mental anguish this woman has been put through is enough to put her in a deep depression, to make her extremely anxious, impacting the rest of her family, let alone the physical trauma that she was going through, going to the ER up to 4 times, elevated vital signs, leaking fluid. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a doctor, but these are just facts that I am sure 60-year-old white male, far right-wing Trumper Ken Paxton did not consider, or didn't, even worse, didn't care about, as he fought this for whatever clicks he wants to get or support on the far right. This is not where America is. And abortion, what he is teaching most Americans as this story gets amplified and as this woman has to run away from the state of Texas to get the health care she needs, what this is teaching America is what America already, most of it knows, that abortion is not just some lazy woman who had sex by mistake. Like Ken Paxton had sex by mistake with someone and got someone pregnant and now needs to get rid of it. That's like crazy. This is health care.
Yeah.
These are doctors saying, unfortunately, we have to make this very difficult decision because we need to save the life of the mother, and the life of this fetus is not viable.
Yeah.
So, once again, in Texas, far-right Republicans are showing Americans just how sick and cruel they can be to women when they are seeking life-saving health care. If I were a woman in the state of Texas, I'd be afraid.
Yeah.
I'd be literally afraid to lose my health care and my rights.
And I would add that Kate Cox proved to us that these exemptions are not true, right? We saw a woman having a baby, 99% chance of a miscarriage or death right after birth. And the state said no, right? This is the life of the mother, right? She has been in and out of the hospital, and the state is saying, well, prove to us that you're really going to die. I mean, so I think that what I think is so important about this case is that it really proves that these exceptions are not true, that these bans that were built with exceptions, they're not really exceptions. They're not really available.
And Mika, as Kate herself says, she's fortunate enough to be able to afford to travel out of state. She has a support network that can help her, although, of course, they are now scared that the law could come after them in Texas.
Right.
I mean, this is the absurdity of her situation, is even her husband faces some kind of legal retribution if he helps her get an abortion that she needs. This is health care. I mean, in Kate's case, she wants a big family. She said she wants a big family. She wants this child. This is a health care situation. Her health will be at risk. And as Molly was saying, Republicans you speak to and have said, well, there are exceptions, that this should never happen. We shouldn't have cases like this. But we have a case like this, and it's going all the way to the top, of the legal structure in Texas, and it won't be the only one. This won't be the only one. We know it's not the only one of a woman who needs this health care. It's basic health care to keep her health and
consequences of Trump. Vanity Fair's Molly Jong-Fast, thank you so much for being on this morning. We'll see you again very soon. And coming up, Jack Smith is asking the Supreme Court to get involved in the federal election interference case again.
To step in immediately to decide whether former President Trump has immunity from prosecution for his actions in trying to overturn the 2020 election results. In a filing with the High Court yesterday, Smith stated it is, quote, of imperative public importance to the court decide the question so Trump's trial can move forward as scheduled in March. Under the timeline proposed by Smith, the court could hear arguments and issue a ruling in a matter of weeks if it does, in fact, decide to step in. In a brief order issued just hours after Smith's filing, the court asked Trump's legal team to respond by December 20th. Trump campaign issued a statement accusing Smith of attempting to interfere in the 2024 election. Joining us now, former U.S. Attorney and an MSNBC contributor, Barbara McQuaid, and State Attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida, Dave Ehrenberg. Good morning to you both. Barbara, I'll start with you. What do you read into this request from Jack Smith? Is he trying to sort of short-circuit the argument that might come from the Trump defense team here?
Yes, this is a really interesting strategy. I have to say I didn't see it coming, but it is a really shrewd move on the part of Jack Smith. He's trying to leapfrog the Court of Appeals, because if this case were to play out in the normal course, there could be a delay of many months, which would jeopardize that March 4th trial date. And so what Jack Smith is essentially saying here is, look, we all know that this is the kind of question that's going to the Supreme Court anyway, so there's no need to waste our time going to the Court of Appeals. It's a rare move, Willie, but it's not unprecedented. It's happened 49 times in the last 100 years, and it's happened 25 times in the past 5 years. Usually it's for cases with some urgency, like COVID cases or gerrymandering cases, but it's also been used for student loans. And so when time is of the essence, this is a move that makes a lot of sense.
So, Dave, it's not unprecedented, and it seems certainly timeliness is an issue here. But what's your read on the request? But also, how do you think the Supreme Court will rule?
Well, it was a positive development yesterday when the court granted the expedited review of the request. So that tells me that they're in line with thinking that this is a special urgent consideration. They know the stakes here. And Jack Smith was right to go to the Supreme Court. The District Court of Appeal, the District of Columbia Court of Appeal, they took their time, taking weeks to determine the gag order issue. I mean, if they took weeks on that, can you imagine how long they take on this? And Donald Trump is now complaining that Jack Smith's going to the Supreme Court. You would think he would want that to determine whether or not he has presidential immunity. But that's because it was never about immunity. It was always about delays.
So we should also note that, of course, the Supreme Court had ruled against Trump during some of the 2020 election cases, except for Clarence Thomas. And we know, of course, that his wife has been outed as being prominently involved in efforts to help overturn that election. There will be calls for Clarence Thomas to recuse himself. Do you see any scenario where that would happen?
Nope. Clarence Thomas has no shame. He's going to stay on the court. He's going to help decide these issues. But he's one of 9, and it's been shown that even the justices that Donald Trump appointed, the 3 justices out of 9, have ruled consistently against him on issues like his taxes, for example, issues about document production. So I think in the end, the Supreme Court will do the right thing here. I mean, I know that make me look like a Pollyanna, but I think they understand the moment we're in.
So, Barbara, the thinking with all of these cases against Donald Trump is that the one we're talking about, everything around the 2020 election, January 6th, the federal case, is the one that probably could go forward before the election. Is there anything you've seen lately, anything with this request here that tells you it too could be pushed down the road a bit?
It is possible. If the court were to deny this request, that would mean that the Court of Appeals has to hear it. And as we just heard, that could take many months. So that would be one thing that could happen. There are also all kinds of other things that could happen, Willie. You know, a case takes on a life of its own and gets sort of organic. There are other motions yet to be filed. Donald Trump has filed motions for selective prosecution and vindictive prosecution. Again, I don't think those are going anywhere. There's a double jeopardy case that has already been ruled upon by the district court. That one could go on appeal. And so there are a number of things that could slow down a case. But one thing I think does seem certain, Jack Smith seems very focused on keeping this on track. And so far, the district court judge, Tanya Chutkan, seems to be moving with appropriate speed to make sure that that date sticks as well. So I would say it looks good, but it's never a certainty.
We will see. Another legal matter tied to the 2020 election. Former Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani is on trial to determine how much he will have to pay in restitution for defaming 2 black election workers after the 2020 presidential race. Lawyers for former election workers Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss yesterday provided thousands of examples of harassment and racial slurs thrown at them. The threatening messages came after Giuliani promoted and parroted false conspiracy theories that the pair was tampering with ballots in the close Georgia race. They were not. On at least one occasion, Giuliani reportedly directed Trump supporters to Freeman's home. The Washington Post reports U.S. District Court Judge Beryl A. Howell instructed jurors she had found Giuliani liable for more than a dozen defamatory statements, and that the only question is how much he should pay in damages for the violent threats and harassment Freeman and Moss received. Giuliani's lawyer focused his statement on the yet-to-be-determined settlement. He stressed it would be, quote, the end of Mr. Giuliani if Freeman and Moss were awarded the millions of dollars they're seeking. But Giuliani is doubling down. Speaking to reporters after court yesterday, he insisted now, though he didn't previously, that his claims about the 2 were true.
Whatever happened to them, it's unfortunate if other people overreacted, but everything I said about them is true.
Do you regret what you did to Ruby?
Of course I don't regret it. I told the truth.
Of course I don't regret it. I told the truth. Dave, help me out here, because in the trial, now they're in the damages portion of this, but he effectively said, yes, I said things that were not true. He said that on the record. Also, I mean, we've told this story a million times, but it's worth repeating. He made up this story, said there was a video showing Freeman and Moss exchanging what he suggested could be vials of drugs. We'll put that matter to the side, the racial element of it. It was a mint, we found out. It was a breath mint being passed back and forth. And they endured people showing up at their house, pushing through the front door. They had to move. They've been threatened online. So what's he doing now, claiming he was telling the truth when previously he said he made it all up?
He's doubling down, and it's bizarre and it's repulsive. I mean, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. He's buying a bigger shovel. And I think he knows that he's going to lose. He's already lost the case, but now it's about damages. And he thinks that, look, you can't get blood from a stone. He is broke, and he probably thinks that I'm not going to have to pay it because I don't have it. But his reputation continues to be hurt every day. I mean, just when you think that he can go no lower, the bottom falls through.
But Dave, what about like E. Jean Carroll? Can they sue again?
Yes. Mika, every time that he makes a defamatory statement, he's subject to be sued. But unlike Donald Trump, who still has assets, Rudy Giuliani really is dead broke. I mean, he even has an IRS lien on his property in Palm Beach. So I think he's just counting on the fact that they're going to chase his money for years, but he's going to evade it. They're not going to get any of whatever money he has squirreled away. And so he thinks he has impunity to say what he wants. And that's why I think he's going to take the stand, because I think he's going to go on his diatribe, his narrative, hoping also that it pleases the boss, Donald Trump.
Yeah, this clearly, Barbara, is desperation. Remember, he had to convince Donald Trump to hold a fundraiser for him at Mar-a-Lago to try to raise some money for his legal defense. So is that all this is, a desperate man trying to save some money?
I think so, but I don't think it's going to matter to the court. I think after hearing all this testimony, the court is going to do two things. One is award compensatory damages. That's why they want to hear about all of the things that have happened to Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, their pain and suffering, their lost wages, all of the compensation that they are due. But the other thing I think the court will do, especially if Rudy Giuliani continues to double down, is award punitive damages. And that's extra money designed just to punish the person for doing something that's so wrong. And it's important to award punitive damages as a deterrent for him and other people who might think this is how we do business in America. And so even if the money isn't collectible, even if they have to chase him for the rest of his life, it's really important to see a big dollar sign awarded against Rudy Giuliani for what he did to these women.
Barbara McQuaid, Dave Aronberg, thank you both. It's 2 minutes past the top of the hour. Our top story this hour, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is here in the U.S. for the third time since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February of 2022. He'll meet with President Biden at the White House to discuss his country's needs on the battlefield and the importance of America's continued support. President Biden has proposed just over $60 billion in new wartime funding for Ukraine as part of a national security package. But Republicans say that foreign aid must be tied to additional funding and policy changes at the southern border. Joining us from Moscow, NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Keir, how is this new visit from Zelensky playing in Russia?
Well, Mika, this is an absolutely pivotal week in the Ukraine and Russia story. President Zelensky's trip to Washington is vital in the ways that you laid out, vital in his efforts to persuade the U.S. to continue to fund Ukraine's military efforts. And then later in the week in Europe, the Europeans will decide whether to proceed with accession for Ukraine to the European Union, despite the objections so far of Viktor Orbán in Hungary. So a very important week for Zelensky and also for President Putin, who this week will hold for the first time in years a question and answer session with journalists, the Russian public, combining that with the traditional radio phone-in that he's held. That you'll remember it, that kind of news conference that goes on for hour after hour. He's going to do that again on Thursday. And what we heard from the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, today is that the Russian government is watching events there in Washington very closely, trying to argue that it doesn't matter whether the US would fund Ukraine, or at least it doesn't matter in the sense he says, he's been briefing journalists, that it would just be bad money after good money, if you like. That's Russia's argument. And then we also heard from our own Peter Alexander today, a briefing from the National Security Council, talking about that Russia continues to push an offensive since October that the National Security Council spokesperson saying has lost Russia 13,000 troops, and suggesting that Russia's maximalist aims remain to try and take all of Ukraine. I think that's interesting. I think that there is going to be a question this week about what we hear from President Putin, whether the Kremlin is watching events in Israel and Gaza, watching events there in Washington, whether the Kremlin is wondering whether the mood is changing, if you like, whether it is going to try to reach for some kind of a freeze in this conflict, some kind of an agreement, if you like, that the territory held by both sides should remain the same. Now, the issue is, of course, that clearly President Zelensky is unlikely to accept that. And I think what you're going to hear from President Zelensky during his trip there in Washington is that in the end, you can't trust Russia. In the end, Russia's aims are going to be to continue to try and put pressure on Ukraine territory in terms of territory, and that is why the US should continue to support Ukraine financially.
Keir, Zelensky's visit, of course, comes as Vladimir Putin announcing he will seek another term and run for re-election on March 17th, putting that in quotes. And that comes as one of his opposition rivals, imprisoned activist Alexei Navalny, has reportedly been moved out of the penal colony where he was serving, according to his supporters, who say his whereabouts are unknown. What more can you tell us about Alexei Navalny?
Yeah, it's a mystery. Not clear what's happened and why. He was supposed to be present for a court hearing today. He wasn't there. His name has been removed from the list of prisoners at the prison where he's being held. His spokesperson saying that he's now been missing for 7 days. There is some suggestion that he had some kind of an illness at some recent stage. But it may also be, and I'm speculating, but everybody is, it may also be that he is being, kind of moved out of the spotlight for this crucial week, particularly as we prepare for President Putin to take on this hours-long question and answer session later in the week. So, listen, it's completely feasible that Navalny will just reappear at some stage, and that he'll just have been moved from one prison to another, for example. But it is a mystery right now.
NBC's Keir Simmons reporting from Moscow. Thank you very much. Willie?
So, Jonathan Lemire with President Zelensky in Washington right now, going door to door, reminding members of Congress, of course, the president, he needs the United States. Without the United States, they lose the war. There is talk, as we were speaking with Admiral Stavridis a little bit earlier, the counteroffensive did not go as planned. It did not work. They didn't push into new territory. So perhaps a rethinking of strategy as they think about how much money to give.
First, we should note, as questions persist about Navalny's whereabouts, that the U.S. just had an offer rejected by the Russians to free Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, Americans being held there in Russia. And as far as this counteroffensive goes, you're right. It was a failure. It needs to be said as such that the Ukrainians did not make much in the way of territory. The Russians had really dug in. They were defending their territory, the land they had seized illegally from Ukraine. And already there were questions about how long the Allies would be able to support this effort, how much pressure would they then put on Kyiv to head to the negotiating table. Now, Zelensky has said he doesn't want to do that. He wants to fight to reclaim all of that territory. U.S. officials say that's unrealistic. They're not going to get all of it back. But Zelensky arrives in Washington now to try to convince Congress to open up the purse strings again for Ukraine, but it seems very unlikely to happen, at least this week. Senators from both sides of the aisle have signaled openly that they don't think a deal can get done these days because of what Republicans want, connecting it to border security. This probably pushes into the new year. It gets that much more complicated because there's going to be a debate in Congress about keeping the government funding, keeping the government open with that spending bill. So this is only going to get harder. And we have heard President Biden since the first day of the invasion say that the U.S. will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. But now, through no fault of this president, that's really being tested. And it does seem that if the U.S. is not able to supply aid soon, it will have disastrous consequences for Ukraine on the battlefield and may prompt other European allies to question their own support, saying, well, if the United States is not involved, why should we? And
President Biden saying clearly again yesterday, Vladimir Putin cannot win this war and needs Congress's help to continue to back. We'll see where that goes. Meanwhile, in Congress, NBC News learning the Republican-controlled House is expected to vote tomorrow to formalize its impeachment inquiry into President Biden. That's according to two sources familiar with the matter. The resolution to authorize the probe set to go before the Republican-led House Rules Committee today. Let's bring in former MSNBC host Chris Matthews, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, and former policy director for the 2012 Mitt Romney presidential campaign and Romney's chief policy advisor, Lan He-chen. Katty K also with us this hour as well. Good to see you all. Chris, I'll start with you. Let's start with the impeachment inquiry, something that used to be used sparingly now appears to just be a political tool back and forth between the parties.
You know, this is a huge political week. Apart from all the geopolitical questions about the world and how the world's operating, our country is in a real political squeeze. Joe Biden, as he faces this joke of an impeachment effort by the House Republicans, he has to decide, how does he work with the Hispanic groups to try to get something done on the border? Something. How does he focus or talk to Zelensky? Zelensky comes today and says, can you do something on the border? Europe's united. You've united Europe and NATO against the Russians. Can't you do something on your border to help this along a bit? All the Republicans seem to want is something where we actually squeeze the definition of an asylum seeker so that it's actually an accurate one. Can't you do something? I think he's got a real threat here. And I think the Russians are trying to decide between a freeze proposition with the Ukrainians and actually going back to war with them, which it looks like they're going to have to do because Zelensky wants to fight. So all these questions are up in the air. The Europeans, the United States, and especially Joe Biden, he's got to make a move here. If he can't win the war with Ukraine, what's his justification of continuing in office except for protecting us from Trump? He's got to continue that fight, and this is the week the Senate could go off, just walk away and say we're not going to continue the fight. And so in next year, we see the situation deteriorating to a desperate situation in Ukraine because the Senate's not even operating. It's up to the president to move the ball, I think. And I think it's a big question for him politically. Can he move the Hispanic groups and say, we got to tighten up the definition of asylum? Because Joe Biden has said the average person in the Northeast in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin doesn't distinguish between asylum seekers and people who simply come to this country for a better life. That's how they look at them. They're crossing the border illegally to come to America for a better life. And he has to do something about limiting that number to an acceptable number. And on this impeachment thing, it's a joke. It's ridiculous. They should make every member of the Republican House say, what reason do you have to impeach this guy? What evidence do you have to bring to the table? Why are you doing this except you don't like Hunter Biden? He's already facing prosecution. So what's your beef with the president?
Yeah.
So Mike Barnicle, when you look at everything the president has before him, turning the corner into the holidays, almost certain if you talk to people on Capitol Hill that this funding deal for Ukraine is not going to get done here in the next couple of days. They have to kick the can down the road to January. How is the president feeling about everything before him, by the way, as he approaches the presidential campaign against Donald Trump?
You know, we're sitting here around this table, the four of us. We lead fairly normal lives in the United States of America. If you're the president of the United States, you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. I mean, given the weight that he's carrying and the impeachment process that Chris was just alluding to. Unfortunately, sadly, in this country, there's a huge percentage of the voting population who think impeachment on both sides is now normal. It's part of politics. Oh, they impeached our guy. We'll try and impeach this guy. And what it does is really disturbing because it twists people's view of politics in America to the point where Everybody seems so cynical each and every day. Nothing gets done. Nothing ever gets done because they're all tied up and just back and forth parleying. And it's a sad state of affairs when you consider the fact that the United States of America has Zelensky in town in Washington, D.C. today, basically saying, you know, we're the last stop for Russia on the way into Europe. We are the last stop. The Ukraine border is the last stop. Please help us stop Russia. And it's not going to happen. They're not going to get the money.
Not this week, it would certainly appear. And if the money does come down the road, it'll likely be at a smaller number than what the White House wanted. So, Lonnie, I mean, this would, first of all, think of how the United States' reputation in the world would change if it eventually bails on Ukraine after saying that we would be part of the arsenal of democracy here to defend you. And then at home, if impeachment is becoming this political matter, that speaks so poorly of us as well, but also could really, in the day-to-day, really feels like it could backfire on Republicans, could it not? That this is something that they're focusing on this, in impeachment, and the president's son, as opposed to the things that matter day in, day out, including keeping the government open next year and supporting our allies.
Well, look, dysfunction here in the United States, in our government, in our inability to get things done, I think that's something people around the world see. When I travel around the world, that's something that you hear all the time. Yeah. Why can't the United States function the way we expect the United States to function, as an effective democracy with 3 branches of government and all the things you learn in school? Why does it not appear to work that way? Now, I think with respect to Republicans in Congress, the 2 issues they need to be focused on are the economy and immigration. Those are the 2 issues as they go into next year's election where they probably have some form of high ground. And so I think the challenge for the Biden administration continues to be on those 2 issues. For the president, I think it works in his advantage just to do something, to Chris's point. Immigration is one of those issues. You know, he goes out there, he's able to find some kind of a solution. In some ways, that takes care of an issue that has been a vexing issue for this White House and a vexing issue for the president's reelection campaign. It seems to me it's a fairly easy political calculus for the president here. I get that there's some internal pressure within constituencies within the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, we're heading toward a general election. And this is the opportunity for the president to address an issue that a lot of people perceive as a weakness of his.
So let's take a look at some of the newest polling, which is showing that some recent endorsements have done little to move the needle in Iowa's upcoming Republican caucuses. In the latest NBC News Des Moines Register Mediacom poll, 54% of likely caucus goers say it doesn't matter that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was recently endorsed by the state's own Republican governor, Kim Reynolds, and more than 70% say it doesn't matter that DeSantis is being backed by a key evangelical leader in the state, or that former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has the endorsement of the conservative Koch political network. Chris Matthews, wonder what you think of that. And I'd like to add into the overall challenge for President Biden is, you know, you see these poll numbers coming out, and I think Democrats get nervous, legitimately. You feel like the numbers should be farther apart. And I think also, especially on the issue of abortion, when you see cases like the one in Texas playing out, doesn't that spell out for busy voters who may have a lot on their plates and they're not tuning in right now? But isn't a case like that something that makes you stop and think?
Well, it sure does. I mean, we've all thought that Roe v. Wade was not perfect, but it worked.
No.
And a lot of people said it's not quite right with my moral framework. Of course that's the case. It was a compromise. But it did segment people into the 3 trimesters, and it did protect life, and it did do something in terms of society's concern. This new thing of just everybody for himself and this crazy lieutenant governor down to that lieutenant, what is it, special prosecutor down there in Texas. Paxton's all over the place acting like he's God. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But I think what's going on, I looked at the Wall Street Journal poll and pretty clearly this weekend. It's interesting. You know, we thought that who's going to vote for Trump this time that didn't vote for him last time? I heard that a million times within the liberal bubble. Oh, no, they'll never vote for him. Well, 95% are going to vote for him who voted for him last time. Biden's down there about 20 points below. Biden's nowhere near this baked in the cake cultist attitude that the Republicans have towards MAGA. They're cultists about it. They don't think about other candidates. They may like Nikki Haley and say she puts on a good show in the debates. They might like her style, her sort of brain. But, you know, they don't change. That's what's amazing. These people are not changing their minds. They are in the cult. They are with this guy in MAGA. There's no intellectual aspect to it. There's no, well, I disagree with him on that, or I didn't like the way he behaved yesterday, or what's he talking about being some sort of authoritarian for the first day? They don't think like that. They're for Trump. That is the crazy thing about these primaries. Just a month from now, they're going to have Iowa caucuses. So what? I mean, what's going to happen? Probably DeSantis will get 20% or something, and maybe Nikki Haley get 19. What difference does it make? The other guy got them all.
And Lonnie,
the rest of it.
Lonnie, if you look at what a lot of these candidates were banking on, which they've said privately and some now say publicly, is that his legal problems for Donald Trump would help them, that voters would finally look at him in a courtroom and say, I just can't do it again. Actually, the opposite is true, as we see in the latest poll out of Iowa, that none of the conventional things that used to matter in politics apply to Donald Trump. That is to say, Governor Reynolds of Iowa or evangelical groups endorsing other candidates. It does not matter.
Yeah, I mean, look, the rules have changed. What we know is that a lot
opposite is true, as we see in the latest poll out of Iowa, that none of the conventional things that used to matter in politics apply to Donald Trump. That is to say, Governor Reynolds of Iowa or evangelical groups endorsing other candidates. It does not matter.
Yeah, I mean, look, the rules have changed. What we know is that a lot by 20, it is what it is. If he wins by a smaller margin, then it becomes potentially more interesting as we set up toward New Hampshire, we set up toward South Carolina. I'm not saying it's going to change the outcome. I'm just saying that it changes the dynamic a little bit in a way that I don't think people have expected.
You mentioned, Lon, immigration and the economy. And the question that the White House asked itself is, looking at just the data, looking at the numbers of unemployment being low, GDP is up, gas prices are coming down, inflation's taking down a little bit. Why people feel the way they do about this economy?
Yeah, it's a vexing problem, I think, for the White House, because the economic measures do suggest an economy that on many measures is doing well. I think it's how people feel about the economy. One thing to point out is that there are more Americans since the start of the pandemic who are working multiple jobs. And what that tells us is that a lot of Americans are having to work very hard to make it work. Inflation has tamed. There's no question about that. But the problem is that the $5 loaf of bread is not going back to $4 or $3. The fact that it's $5.02 as opposed to $5.10. The challenge is, how do you message around that? Well, it's better than it was. But the reality is, for many Americans, it's a very, very difficult daily economic condition. Even if the labor market numbers are good, the growth numbers are good, we're seeing a lot of suggestions that the economy we're going to have this soft landing people have talked about. But, you know, the challenge is, how do people feel? And I think people feel economically a little bit of anxiety still.
You know, Caddy, Lonnie just pointed out an obvious fact that it's how people feel about the economy. And yet there's also a subplot there, how people feel about the country itself. And I think a lot of people feel that the United States, a lot of Americans feel that the country is just so dysfunctional right now that they can't get a handle on where do we go next. And by next, by their future, I mean a month from now, 6 months from now, not down the road. And I'm wondering what the feeling is. Is there a similar feeling about the United States now enveloping European thought about the United States?
I think that's been there for a while, honestly, Mike, the feeling that you can't quite trust America. And you know, people were looking to the next election and the conversation here. I mean, I went through a few years where people didn't ask me every time I came to Europe, what about Donald Trump? And it was kind of nice to talk about something else. But I'm back here now, and the first conversation that everybody has, the first question I'm asked is Donald Trump going to be reelected? And that's kind of, you know, casual day-to-day conversations, but those are also the conversations that are being asked in governments all around Europe, and they honestly don't have an answer as to how they would deal with that. Everybody expects that America would pull out of NATO, that funding for Ukraine would stop, that Russia would win in Ukraine and potentially take over Ukraine, and other countries as well could then feel vulnerable. And there's an awful lot of uncertainty around the political instability in America every time the debt ceiling is broached. But there isn't really another game in town still. I mean,
no.
People look to China, and they don't necessarily want China to be the world's only superpower. So I think there's a feeling that they would like America to be more functional, to work better as a government, to be more reliable as a partner and an ally, but they know that they can't count on that at the moment.
Chris Matthews, this may, I'm sure it's naive on my part, but if Trump wins the primary by a wide margin, is there going to be any regret among the primary opponents for not fully going after him, except for Chris Christie? I mean, there's so much material. And you think of John McCain at that moment with that voter when he said, no, he's a good man, when they were trying to say something incorrect. A great moment. Yeah. And there's so many opportunities for that moment. But I guess what is the primary voters they can't handle that moment?
It's a great question. I think in the short run, no. I think I looked at the candidates and how they're standing in the latest Wall Street Journal poll this weekend. And all the three candidates on that stage, the most recent debate and all the debates, who've never questioned Trump, and that would be Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Right.
All three of them have just laid down, if you will, for Trump. They're all ahead of Chris Christie. All three of them are ahead of Chris. So not only does Trump get his 50% roughly of the vote, but he gets another 40% or 45% of those who lay down for him. So he's running about 95%, really. They're afraid of him. Even now, Ron DeSantis is thinking about 28. We all know he's thinking about 28. Well, he can't be thinking about 24. He's thinking about 28. Where's he going to be? He wants to run against, Gavin Newsom, maybe. I mean, I don't know what he's thinking about, but he wants to stay alive down in Florida. And he's afraid of Trump. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how scaredy cats they are, to use a kid's expression. They're scaredy cats of this guy. And the only one is Chris Christie, who I love what he does, because I love having someone tell the truth, because that's refreshing for a few minutes every night for a 2-hour debate. And I like him. Yeah. And I think Chris Christie would have been a great Reagan Democrat back in the 80s. He would have been a great Reagan Republican. He is a classic, the kind of guy I grew up with, who my dad hung out with. He's a good guy. Mm-hmm. But he's not with this crowd. This crowd is strange. He may pull out of the race to help Nikki, but I'll tell you, he seems like a good guy to be president. And the others look like they don't have the guts to be president, really. And even Nikki is not showing the guts that she has to show for the future. And she has a future. I don't think.
All right. Former MSNBC host Chris Matthews and former chief policy advisor for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, Lan-Hee Chen. Thank you both very much for coming on this morning. We will see you soon. And still ahead on Morning